Tonight, what I want to do is talk about the concept of the cultural complex and then give one major example because I'd like to lead you through the kind of thinking that I've done. A lot of the original work I did with Sam Kimball's and the books that I've done since then involve some 60 or 70 Jungian analysts from around the world. So I had the idea, rather than creating a theory by myself, I should turn it over to our international Jungian community and let the community create the theory by examining cultural complexes in the context of different cultures. So that's what I've been doing for the past decade. And it's been a wonderful experience because you get to travel the world and you just sit at home and all these wonderful people are contributing really interesting things that you never would have thought about in terms of what for them is the most cultural complex that's defined either their own country or their experience in their country. So I want to give you, I want to orient you to the theoretical structure of the idea, and then I want to show you how it works through a discussion of the relationship between the West and Islam, which is like, you know, talking about Jupiter and Mars or something. It's so big. The West is sort of a construct, and Islam is a construct in many ways, but that's how it's presented to us. And so I want to do that. And then tomorrow at the workshop, I'm going to speak about Obamacare as a cultural complex in terms of how divisive it's been in our society. And then also Trump and the collective psyche, which of course is a catastrophic division, not just in our country, but I think globally. And so in a way tonight is a preparation for tomorrow, but I think also what I have to say will stand on its own tonight. I'm actually quite comfortable being interrupted. I like interaction, and so if you don't like something I say, or you don't understand something I'm saying, or you get agitated, because when you discuss cultural complexes, the way you know a cultural complex is by the emotional reactivity of people. And I've never given a talk where somebody hasn't exploded. So I welcome temperate explosions. So the purpose of tonight's talk is to introduce you to the basic concept of the cultural complex. And I want to link it both to Jung's original work on complex theory, which was his original work at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. That's how he came into contact with Freud, was through his work on the complex, personal complex. And the cultural complex theory is really an extension of Jung's original work on personal complexes. It just comes 100 years later. In our personal psychotherapies and analysis, whether we're a patient or an analysand or an analyst or a therapist or a citizen, mostly we think in terms of personal complexes that cause havoc to us on occasion, whether it be a father complex or a mother complex or an inferiority complex. That all grew out of Jung's original work. But there's another layer of complexes, cultural complexes, which exist in the culture as a whole, and we also carry in our individual psyches. And that's why this 1926 map of Jung's is so interesting to me. He called this a map of the psyche. And what's interesting is it looks sort of geological and sort of evolutionary. So you may mistake it for biology or geology or something, but it's really important to keep in mind this is actually a map of the psyche as Jung envisioned it just about 100 years ago. And at the very top, he saw the individual psyche, which is a really rather puny thing bobbing just above the surface of the ocean or the depths. And then there's the families, clans, nations, large group, primate ancestors, animal ancestors. And then the one that always confused me was the central fire, and maybe we'll get to the central fire at some point. But this is how he conceived of the psyche, and he didn't just conceive of it as sort of for all men together. He conceived of this as existing in every man and woman. So it's a map of the psyche that each of us carries inside and that exists between us. I don't think I've ever seen, I think it's a really extraordinary sort of diagram, because it has a kind of evolutionary quality to it when you talk about primate ancestors. Obviously, you're talking, yes?
Is it fair to say that the age, the central fire, is the collective unconscious?
Well,
could you repeat the question?
Yes. Is it fair to say that the central fire is the collective unconscious? And that would certainly be one way to think about it. I carried around the question of the central fire for years, and then I went down to the Galapagos, and I was reading all about Darwin's early explorations, and I found myself on a black lava beach, and there were all sorts of animal and amphibian and other life right in this sort of thin zone where the sea meets the volcanic landscape. And I actually thought of the central fire as the source of life itself. But if you're talking in psyche, then it would be the collective unconscious. In a way, today, maybe the biggest problem we all face is that the central fire is in danger. That is, with the threat of extinction of many species, over 50%, I think, in the next several decades, and so on. I do feel that there's a tremendous agitation in the cultural psyche and so on at the level of the central fire, because I think the extinction of life itself is currently at stake. And one wonders if that deepest extinction anxiety isn't fueling a lot of the crises that we're seeing around the world. But I'm way ahead of the game here, and it's just so what's important to note about Jung and his relationship to the map of the psyche is that this is relatively early Jung, and Jung at one point had a very lively interest and responsiveness to the collective psyche as distinguished from the collective unconscious. And a lot of his writings in Volume 10, for instance, Wotan After the Catastrophe, the Swiss line and the European Spectrum, The Complications of American Psychology, The Dreamlike World of India. He's really talking in this volume, he's talking a lot about the collective psyche, but in fact, from about 1950 to close to 2000, the whole Jungian tradition's concern with the so-called collective psyche almost vanished. And most of the emphasis was on individuation, with the notion that the task of the individual was to separate out from the collective psyche. And so I think our tradition took a rather dim and shadowy view of the collective psyche, which kind of got relegated to the back 40. And so a lot of what you read from 1950 to 2000 in Jungian literatures is really about individuation, in which the movement is from the individual at the top down to the archetypes of the collective unconscious and the back and forth between them. And you don't hear a lot about nations, clans, families, large group. That whole side of Jung gets left out of the equation. That's my, and I have an idea which I want to share with you about why that occurred, but to demonstrate Jung's early and real interest in the collective psyche, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with his dream of 1913. Shortly after he broke with Freud and he was profoundly disoriented, he reported the following in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. In October, while I was alone on a journey, I was suddenly seized by an overpowering vision. I saw a monstrous flood covering all the northern and low-lying lands between the North Sea and the Alps. When it came up to Switzerland, I saw that the mountains grew higher and higher to protect our country. I realized that a frightful catastrophe was in progress. I saw mighty yellow waves, the floating rubble of civilization, and the drowned bodies of uncounted thousands. Then the whole sea turned to blood. And 2 weeks later, the same vision recurred, except it was more vivid and the blood was more emphasized, according to Jung. And an inner voice spoke, "Look at it well, it is wholly real, and it will be so. You cannot doubt it." Because he was trained as a psychiatrist, he had worked with schizophrenic patients, primarily in the Bergholzi Hospital in Switzerland. He thought that he was in danger of suffering a personal psychosis caused by the profound disorientation of breaking with Freud. He later came to interpret this dream as a kind of anticipatory dream of World War I, which broke out not long after that. So what you see in Jung's own dream and his reaction to it, he actually was responding to individuals, family, clans, nations, large group European man. I don't know if the primary ancestor is the primary ancestor, but that dream goes from A to at least E, and Jung is having trouble sorting out what belongs to the personal level of the psyche and what belongs to the cultural level of the psyche and what we might say belongs to collective unconscious level of the psyche. So you see this, and any of us that have had big dreams like this often are profoundly disoriented because it's, in some ways there's archetypal material, there's cultural material, and personal material, and it can get all mixed up, as it did in Jung's, this early dream of Jung. And so his interpretation of this dream changed from his fear of suffer a personal psychosis to that of an anticipatory dream of the collective catastrophe of World War I. Now, there are many interpreters, including Winnicott, who actually went back to Jung's early interpretation of his dream and thought that he was really having a personal psychosis and dismissed the collective level of the psyche. So you get into very fuzzy territory when you're talking about these things. So I want to take a little bit of time to make clear what I think we mean by collective psyche. It's a word that we use in the Jungian tradition all the time, and like many of our words, it's kind of freighted with ambiguity. But it is foundational to how we as Jungians tend to approach the world and understand its conflicts, urges, and yearnings. And we use the phrase collective psyche to designate that part of psychic life that threads through the conscious and unconscious mind in a group of people and inside individual members of that group, whether the group be a Jung Institute in Los Angeles or San Francisco, a group of people such as blacks or whites or Latinos or Asians, a state such as California, a nation such as the United States, our entire global home. So each of those you can think of as having their own collective psyche. It would be true. So there are different levels to the collective psyche itself. The collective psyche often seems to have a life of its own, and most times it is hard to define, although one can sense or intuit it in such things as the spirit of the times. It's easy enough to confuse the collective psyche with sociology in that both speak to the realities, longings, and fears that exist within various groups that differ in all sorts of significant ways: age, gender, race, socioeconomics, politics, ethnicity, religious values, etc. And sociologists describe and define these things in detail, the characteristics that distinguish one group from another, and they do it in more or less objective categories. This, to me, is a really important point, a differentiation that I hope I want to emphasize. How those differences between groups and gender and race and ethnicity and religion, how they actually live inside of us, how they live inside the psyche of individuals and groups, is not necessarily what sociologists describe. They're inside of us, they're more inchoate, they're not nearly as well defined, they're not nearly as quoted objective. And the difference takes on a more potent shape in our psyches, which don't place as high a value on objectivity, even though we may think we're being objective. One can think of the collective psyche as an inner sociology, a subtle thread that unites and divides and motivates people around the world, and that is filled with all sorts of different group memories, affects, mythologies, and distortions about one's own group and the groups of others. So Jung's great contribution to individual life was his restoring the inner world to its rightful place in the human experience. I think one of our tasks as Jungians today is to emphasize the inner reality and impact of the collective psyche. To name the collective psyche says that there is an inner reality to the experiences of groups that gets communicated in sometimes ineffable ways that shape our deepest collective visions and fears. Rachel Maddow comes to mind. How many of you listen to Rachel Maddow almost religiously? Many. Well, she's doing a great job right now of shaping and defining and clarifying the inner reality and the outer reality of what's going on around Trump and his relationship to Russia and so on. She's really a storyteller, and she's a storyteller from a particular point of view, but she does like facts, and she tries to be factual in her narrating this story, which contributes to the collective psyche, and it contributes to how these stories live inside of us and the shape that they take. This is an extraordinary print image from 1942 or 43 by a German named Weber, who was living in Nazi Germany at the time. It's called Rumor. And I think it's extraordinary because in some ways it is, as we all know, images often do a lot more for us than words do. And this image shows a kind of beast, a collective beast, that's actually forming out of individuals that are being sucked out of their private, personal, individual dwellings. And they start to form the body of the beast. And they contribute, if you look at it's a little, I don't know how clear the image is, but they actually are contributing the eyes and the ears of the beast all the way along its body. And if you look to the right, it's a little, sometimes this image gets a little fuzzy. If you look at some of these creatures, they're not really human. They're almost demonic-like figures that are flying out of the houses. They may start off as human, but by the time they join this beast, they've really become somewhat demonic creatures. And this is one way to think about the more negative aspects of how the collective psyche can function, particularly at a time of trauma and distress, when a society is undergoing enormous turmoil and conflict. And so you get this collective beast that forms. And in some ways, this is not unfamiliar to all of us in this room in terms of how we're trying to sort out what belongs, which narrative belongs to the beast and which narrative belongs to those of us who think of ourselves as rational. Or is there a way of sorting that out, particularly when you get competing collective beasts? And I think this is a wonderful image of the collective psyche. I want to give you another example of this. And this would be akin to what Jung, I think he stole this from the French, the abaissement du niveau mental, the lowering of the mental threshold in individuals who suffer severe mental illness. They're kind of, the mental wave kind of deteriorates and gets lower and lower. And in a way, this is the equivalence in the collective psyche of the abaissement du niveau mental, in which the collective cognitive functioning and affective and feeling differentiate gets lowered to the most basic wave of human psyche. And I want to show you another image that demonstrates this. I'm trying to communicate what the collective psyche looks like and feels like, or can look like and feel like. It certainly it doesn't always take this form. This is called The Dream of Reason. I saw it in San Francisco at an exhibit of contemporary Chinese art, and that's Mao there sleeping in the back. It's called The Dream of Reason. This object really looked like a giant Jungian sand tray. I doubt if the artist was familiar with sand tray, but it filled up the entire space in a relatively small gallery. And when you walked in, it was just kind of astonishingly beautiful and alive. And in this image, when you first see it, this sculpture or sand tray, one comes to the conclusion that Mao's Sleep of Reason brought to China a geography of harmony between diverse groups of people united by a common dream. The orange, green, yellow, blue, brown, and other tribes surrounding Mao seemed to be orchestrated to flow in undulating waves of synchronous creative movement, just like the opening ceremonies of the Olympic Games that were held in Beijing in 2008. That's the same year that Barack Obama continued to offer us his own dream of reason, which promised to transcend in the United States the divisions between red and blue states, black and white races, those who have and have not, men and women. And he dreamed about us coming together so that we could address our common problems of healthcare, education, the need to find good jobs, and how to bring an end to divisive wars around the world. On closer inspection, this sleep of reason turns out that the artist's intentions are more sardonic than first meets the eye. What appears to be a bucolic dance of diverse but synchronized tribes is in fact a collection of prehistoric and predatory dinosaurs of different types, and suggests that beneath the first impression of a swirling, harmonious vitality lurk more archaic, primitive forces in the individual and collective psyche. This is a picture of the collective psyche that might break free at any time. These potentially destructive forces can be thought of as cultural complexes, and I'll get to that soon enough, that threaten not only Mao's sleep of reason, but a dream of reason that perhaps we all share of our species learning to harness in collaborative synergy the dynamic drives of different individual groups, tribes, nations, and continents. But one has to think, what happens if any one of these groups of dinosaurs panics or revolts and begins a stampede of divergent instinctual forces? And I would suggest that every day in the newspaper and online and television, we're hearing about the chaotic stampede in our newspaper headlines, whether it be in the United States or Syria or Mosul or North Korea. And so we have to wonder, who are the dinosaurs? And when will they break rank? In the United States, Democrats look at Trump and his Republicans as if they are dinosaurs, and Republicans look at Democrats as if they are dinosaurs. For the first time, I thought maybe the right-wing creationist politician from Alaska, Sarah Palin, got it right in 2008 when she proclaimed that just 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, dinosaurs and humans were walking the earth together. How can we think and talk about these conflicts in a psychological way that makes any sense? And I go back to this. As I said a little earlier, most of Jung's focus was on the individual at the top of his diagram and the instinctual archetypal forces at the bottom of the diagram that you've properly suggested as might be the collective unconscious. So when Jung talked about the rise of Nazism in the mid-30s, and this is a real problem in Jung, and this caused a real problem for all of us who are in the Jungian tradition. Following the 1913 vision of blood covering much of Europe, Jung wrote what to me is one of his most extraordinary essays, Wotan, which also caused him more trouble probably than almost anything he ever said or did. And the problem is that he went straight to the deepest archetypal level of the psyche to understand what was happening in the collective psyche of Germany, out of which emerged a primitive god of lightning, thunder, and destruction. In this seminal essay, he spoke about what happens when archetypal forces are unleashed in the collective psyche and the life of nations. And this is maybe not a situation not unlike what we may be in today. Archetypes are like riverbeds which dry up when the water deserts them, but which it can find again at any time. An archetype is like an old watercourse along which the water of life has flowed for centuries, digging a deep channel for itself. The longer it has flowed in this channel, the more likely it is that sooner or later the water will return to its old bed. The life of the individual as a member of society, and particularly as part of the state, may be regulated like a canal, but the life of nations is a great rushing river which is utterly beyond human control. Thus, the life of nations rolls on unchecked, without guidance, unconscious of where it is going, like a rock crashing down the side of a hill until it is stopped by an obstacle stronger than itself. Political events move from one impasse to the next like a torrent caught in gullies, creeks, and marshes. All human control comes to an end when the individual is caught up in a mass movement. Then the archetypes begin to function, as happens also in the lives of individuals when they are confronted with situations that cannot be dealt with in any of the familiar ways. So here he's writing in 1936, and if you note what he said, is he's now differentiated something about his 1913 dream, because he's saying that the life of nations takes on and can get out of control when the society is under great stress. And then he also adds, as when an individual is under great stress. So he's kind of integrated these two things. He's differentiated out that it can both signal something in the individual psyche and something in the collective psyche. Today, the ancient archetypal riverbeds of rivalrous conflicts between Christians, Jews, and Muslims is once again overflowing its old watercourse with a gushing torrent that threatens to flood the world. And this is by a friend of mine, a Northern California artist named Chester Arnold. It's not a particularly good rendering, but there's this massive ball of collected bits and pieces of all sorts of things, musical instruments, the American flag, bathtubs, you name it, it's all gotten collected into this rolling ball, and it's sort of crashing down the hillside a little bit like what Sisyphus must have been dealing with. And the momentum of such force can be visualized as a flood, Jung said, as an earthquake, or in one of my favorite images of the uncontrolled force of how bits and pieces of collective psyche can be gathered into an onrushing cascade of uncontainable energy, a massive boulder careening unstoppably down a hill. Or as Jung described it in Wotan, the life of nations rolls on unchecked, without guidance, unconscious of where it is going, like a rock crashing down the side of a hill, until it is stopped by an obstacle stronger than itself. Now, the problem that happened to Jung was, when he wrote Wotan, is that because he went straight from the individual level of the psyche to the archetypal level of what was seizing Nazi Germany in the figure of this warlike god Wotan, is that he left out these whole middle layers of the collective psyche. He left out he left out families, clans, nations, and large groups. He left out B to E. He went almost straight to the central fire. And it's a fantastic essay if you intuitively know what Jung's talking about. But if his way of perceiving, if his intuitive way of perceiving is not familiar to you, his language has a kind of quality of excitement about it. He's filled with the energy of the archetype, and you can sense it as you're reading Wotan, and many people read it as Jung being intoxicated and possessed by Wotan, and therefore a supporter of Nazi Germany. And one can see how easily it would be to read that essay in that way, because he goes straight from the personal to the archetypal level, and there's almost nothing in between. And which leads to profound misinterpretation of what he's talking about. I think if you read the essay carefully, you'll see that he's really warning his readers about the danger of this kind of intoxication, but he does it with a language that sometimes belies his own objectivity, and people have read into it an intoxication, Jung's own intoxication with Nazism. It's not my reading, but I can see how people have read it, particularly Freudians who were very sensitive to what they felt was Jung's anti-Semitism and therefore his embrace of Nazism. We don't have to get into that whole complicated issue. But it caused a tremendous problem for Jung and for Jungians. And by 1950 or so, he had written After the Catastrophe, which was really sort of an apology. But then he only had another 10 or 15 years to live, and he was very interested in alchemy and individuation. And he really abandoned all of his interest, I think, this is my reading, in the collective psyche, because it blew up in his face. It just plain blew up in his face. And that's what happens when you start to talk about archetypal forces in collective psyche and the culture. Often when I give talks like this, somebody gets really angry because you inadvertently step on a cultural complex which is filled with emotion and energy. And I think Jung and the Jungian tradition turned away from that side, that really exciting side of Jungian psychology, which was about the collective psyche and the layers of psyche that contributed to that. And so I think of this cultural complex work as our 21st century work as Jungians, which is to pick up where Jung and then the later Jungians sort of abandoned that and really took the attitude that the collective psyche was really something you wanted to individuate out of, and was a rather shadowy realm. And of course it can be an enormously shadowy realm that one does want to individuate out of. But it often left us as a community, I think, isolated in terms of our sense of belonging, our sense of community, our sense of being part of a larger tribe other than our own. These are all sort of personal opinions, but I believe in them. And So I think retrospectively, the way in which Jung went straight to the collective unconscious in Wotan and left out the great middle of the social and cultural levels of the psyche contributed to a profound gap and deep misunderstandings of his psychology, which left us alienated as a community, and also the need for Joe Henderson, who is a very well-known San Francisco analyst, to attempt to fill that void with his notion of the so-called cultural unconscious, which he actually added to Jungian theory in 1962, but nobody picked up on it. It was dropped. And there was the cultural unconscious layer of the psyche was simply, you don't really hear that. You didn't hear that much about it. And so a couple of things we can say about the collective psyche. I don't think it's like complexes. They're neither good nor bad. They simply are. And they can be manipulated for all sorts of purposes, some of which are good and some of which are bad. And the judgment of what is good and what is bad is frequently relative to the point of view of the observer. That's the situation we're in today. If you're on one side of the divide of Republicans and Democrats, the collective psyche that possesses the Republicans who follow Trump is terrible. And if you're on the other side, the progressive view of the Democrats is equally terrible. And so the judgment that falls on these group movements is about the collective psyche is also often quite relative to where you stand. And it's very hard to have a psychological attitude which actually is able to look at both sides in these kinds of divides. That's probably the hardest thing to do, is to have a psychological attitude about the nature of the collective psyche, particularly when it gets activated with powerful cultural complexes. So we can now move from the discussion of the collective psyche to the subject of cultural complexes. What I'm doing is building a model here. We can think of the contents of the personal unconscious as being personal complexes. We can think of the archetypes as being the contents of the collective unconscious. And we can think of cultural complexes as being the building blocks, the fundamental building blocks of the cultural unconscious. I have an opinion about how the language of archetypes has been misused by our community, particularly when we're talking about collective events. I think we go so quickly to notions of the hero and the shadow as explanations for what's going on at any given time in a cultural context, in a movie that we see, or whatever, that over time the words really become meaningless. They become reductive. It's like going to any small town in the United States where you see a McDonald's and a Burger King and a Walmart's, except in the Jungian world you see the anima and the shadow and the animus. And they're just sort of billboards of our theory that get used repetitively as if we're offering some great explanatory principle, and I think they're overused and misused. And this is why I think the notion, and they're misused because they go, like Jung, they're very real. These are very real phenomena. But they go to the archetypal level without going to the specific context in time and place of a particular culture in which a shadow or a hero is embodied. And if you leave out the context of time, place, and specificity, which is really in the realm of the cultural unconscious, you think you're saying a lot and you're really saying nothing. And forgive me for all of us, because I fall into the same trap all the time, of going too quickly to that language without really trying to carefully tease out the specificity of the occurrence or the embodiment of these archetypal forces in specific situations.
Why is that? Why is that?
Why is what?
What you just said. I mean, why do you suppose those particular archetypes become so generic?
So
Generic.
why do I say that? Because I see how...
I agree. I'm
Yeah.
saying, what's the cause?
Well, I think like any human being, we like to understand what we're talking about. We like to have explanations that give meaning and purpose and construct. And our Jungian language has been very helpful with that. And the archetypes really are Jung's kind of premier creation. And they do carry a lot of weight, but I think we go too quickly to them because we're trying to understand phenomena that are so big and powerful and beyond our understanding that it gives us some feeling of control almost, or of rational comprehension that actually betrays the very purpose and meaning of the kinds of things we're describing. But I think it's a natural human I'm not sure who's asking the question. Yeah, thank you. I could.
I mean, why not the archetype of war, self, trickster? I mean, why anima, animus?
I just picked those. All of those are equally.
No, I agree with you.
Yeah.
Why is it? What is it that pushes them to the surface of collective consciousness?
Oh. As opposed to war or trickster or...
Yeah.
Well, trickster, of course, is being used a lot, was used a lot when Trump was running for the presidency. There were a lot of people sort of pushing the trickster idea, which I think had real value. I think he is an archetypal trickster figure in many ways. I think I just chose the three that I did because they're the ones that came to mind as those most commonly used.
Right. I would agree.
Okay.
But it still begs the question, you know, why not self? Why not ego? Why not? I mean, what does it say about those particular archetypes that they're kind of, you know, forcing themselves to the front of the stage?
Well, first of all, it's a really good question. I'm not sure if I have an answer. I think that they're the ones that are often most visible. If you look at any movie, you usually see something with a hero and a shadow figure. I think they're the ones that appear most commonly. I may be wrong about that, but and I think animus, anima are all over the place in every romantic comedy. So I think they're very commonly occurring. I don't think they're the only ones. And I agree with you. Trickster is certainly particular. Well, trickster has been maybe the most. Trickster and shadow, I think, have been the most important. Although I'm going to go to self a little bit later on. It's a good question. I don't think I have a great answer for it. Yes.
Wouldn't the words themselves that we're using for these archetypes have something to do with how they appeal and rise up in our mind? I mean, trickster, you can have images of trickster, self. It's too vague. You know, war is too general unless you're just thinking about major explosions and things. A hero, you can conjure up an image rather quickly. You know, different images, certainly, but a specific.
They come to mind so quickly because the images spring to mind.
Because of the words.
Yeah.
Would you summarize the question?
Yes. The question, which is an excellent question, was I chose 3 words or 4 words. I chose hero, shadow, anima, and animus as being like billboards that line any suburban area. They're used so commonly, and the question was, well, why those particular archetypes, as opposed to other archetypes like trickster and war? So the question was, what's unique about these particular archetypes that call to mind, or that come to mind most quickly when we're thinking about archetypal interpretations? Yes.
I just want to clarify something. So the central, and I'll try to bring it back to what we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
Getting back to the central fire.
Yes.
You said it was the life the source of life itself. So that implies energy, instinct. So is that, I was thinking in terms of the two main, sources of life, thanatos and eros. Does the central fire include both? Or is it just, eros? And the reason I'm bringing it up in terms of the types of archetypes that can be constellated collectively, like the trickster or the war archetype versus the anima or the hero, is it because there's if the central fire is eros only, is it that the hero is able to connect, or the culture is able to connect with that archetype, that central archetype of eros, and the trickster and the war archetypes, the destructive ones, are connecting to a different instinctual energy, such as thanatos, or are they just disconnected from that central fire of eros? The reason that what triggered it was you said, I liked your lava.
Yeah.
Lava. So I was thinking of an eruption of central fire, coming into the collective or the culture from this deep archetypal layers.
I think.
Is that central fire, does it include both the destructive and the life producing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. First of all, I don't quite know what the central fire, I just told you what I thought it is. I think of it as kind of primal energy. It's like the sun. And if you get too close to the sun, you're destroyed. And without the sun, there is no life. The central fire, I think, is the source of all life itself. But life itself has within it death. So
and life, right?
Yeah.
They're connected.
Yes.
I'm feeling like we're getting a little off topic here because we're talking about specific archetypes, when I think really ultimately the point that I felt you were trying to make was that they've lost their potency because we're not willing to understand the cultural matrix within which they actually come from.
I couldn't say it better. I think that is the point. I like the questions, but I actually think the point is that if we go too quickly, as Jung did in Wotan, to the archetypal layer, either we get into tremendous trouble, or over time it just loses its energy because we're not connecting it to the specificity of the cultural context.
Right? Like metaboletics ultimately, right? Like metaboletics.
Yes.
Right? Like you're looking over the shoulder of a culture that created the circumstances that you're looking to understand.
Yes, and I'll try and give a really solid example of this so you see how this thinking layers itself, how my thinking layers itself out.
One more.
Yes.
One more.
Sure.
I'm a little bit in trouble here. Losing its potency to what? What the impression I'm getting is that the archetype is losing its potency to conscious awareness. But if it loses its potency to conscious awareness, then it's more loose in the subterranean realms of our psyche, and in that way it has more power.
Well, I'm actually using it in a different way. I understand what you're saying. What I'm saying is that our language gets emptied of meaning over time, so that in Mill Valley we have an archetypal furniture store, and so if you use your language too much and you don't make sure that you're connecting it with real life, it just becomes emptied of meaning and energy. Not that the archetype itself becomes emptied of meaning and energy, but the way we're using the language gets too glib.
It becomes a cliche.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. It becomes a cliche. Okay. So, I think what I'll do is, let's see, it's 8:35. I'm just going to briefly say what a complex is and how do we recognize it, and then we'll take a break. Personal complexes express themselves in powerful moods and repetitive behaviors. They resist our most heroic efforts at consciousness, and they tend to collect experience that confirms their pre-existing view of the world. They're the psychological analog of the vegetative biological systems, such as those that carry out digestion or maintain blood pressure. An activated personal complex can have its own body language and tone of voice. It operates beneath the level of consciousness. We don't have to think about complexes for them to carry out their autonomous processes of structuring and filtering our experience of ourselves and others. A further characteristic of complexes, elaborated by John Perry, is that they tend to be bipolar or consist of two parts. Most often, when a complex is activated, one part of the bipolar complex emerges from the unconscious and attaches itself to the ego, and the other part gets projected out onto a suitable other. For instance, in a typical negative father complex, a rebellious son inevitably finds the authoritarian father in every teacher, coach, or boss who provides a suitable hook for the negative projection. This bipolarity of the complex leads to an endless round of repetitive skirmishes with the illusory other, who may or may not fit the bill perfectly. Finally, complexes can be recognized by the simplistic certainty of a worldview and one's place in it that they offer us, in the face of the otherwise very difficult task of holding the tension of conflicting and not easily reconcilable multiple points of view.
May I ask a question?
Yes, you may.
Can you repeat, not the whole thing, but just what you said in the very beginning about complexes?
Yes, but I'll do it in the form of cultural complexes now. I actually intended to repeat it because these are characteristics that I worked out with Chauncey Irvine teaching at Langley Porter Neuropsychiatric Institute over a period of 15 years ago, for 15 years, many years ago, and we worked out these characteristics as a way of how do you recognize and think about a complex. And I'll repeat it. A cultural complex expresses itself in powerful moods and repetitive behaviors, both in a group as a whole and in its individual members. Highly charged emotional or affective reactivity is the calling card of a cultural complex. A cultural complex resists our most heroic efforts at consciousness and remains for the most part unconscious. A cultural complex accumulates experiences that validate its point of view and creates a storehouse of self-affirming ancestral memories. For instance, you could think of Trump's cultural complex with its constant reference to fake news as reinforcing his own self-affirming narrative, which insists that only the facts that support his point of view are accurate and all the rest are fake. For those of us in profound opposition to Trump, he and his supporters are caught up in an extremely dangerous cultural complex that looks like they are living in a parallel universe because the complex keeps collecting only those pieces of information that validate its own point of view. That's the whole fake news deal. The fake news deal is that anything that disagrees with the complex through which I perceive the world is unreal, illusory, and a witch's hunt, or whatever you want to call it. So it collects self-affirming memories and only deals with those facts or pieces of information that suit its pre-existing point of view. They function in an involuntary autonomous fashion and tend to affirm a simplistic point of view that replaces most everyday ambiguity and uncertainty with fixed, often self-righteous attitudes to the world. Cultural complexes have archetypal cores, that is, they express typically human attitudes and are rooted in primordial ideas about what is meaningful, making them very hard to resist, reflect upon, and discriminate. So let's take a break here, and then I'm going to give you a big example of what I think is a bipolar pair of cultural complexes, hopefully to kind of make this rather complex idea real for you.
Hi.
I'm Rick.
Hi, Rick.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
You know, when you're talking about the cultural complex.
Good. Good. So I'm going to give you an example now, and I'm going to take some time developing it because I want you to see how what may feel like very abstract ideas, how they actually work in an example. And of course the challenge is to, if you're interested in this model, take the idea of cultural complexes and begin to think for yourself, what do you think are the predominant cultural complexes that you're dealing with, and see if you can tease out the different layers as a kind of exercise. In putting this talk together, for the first time it occurred to me that I could call this image the birth of the 21st century, because in some ways 9/11/2001 has so far been the defining moment of civilization, really, if one can be so grandiose. And for the moment, I just want you to just let this image work on you. It's actually a very carefully constructed image, but I'll deconstruct it for you in time. The example I'm going to give is the example of Islam and the West as two competing, colliding cultural complexes. And I'm going to try and take you inside this a bit, both historically and psychologically. I'm not a historian, and I'm not a student of Islam, but I've read a fair amount about it, and of course, like all of us, I've been living in the collective psyche of our times. And so I'm going to tell you something about how this conflict lives inside, as I imagine it. This is kind of a collective active imagination, if you will, how this conflict between Islam and the West lives inside of each of us at the cultural level of the psyche, inside of each one of us. And this image was taken, actually Diane Sherwood, who was the editor of the Jung journal, created this image with her husband, sort of on the basis of an article I wrote called Unconscious Forces Shaping International Conflicts, Archetypal Defenses of the Group Spirit from Revolutionary America to Confrontation in the Middle East. It was a very ambitious article in which I laid out a theory of how the cultural complexes work in certain circumstances. And the goal of this symbolic picture is to demonstrate the different levels of psychic reality at play in the conflict, showing in a collage rather than a diagram how my elaboration of Jung's 1926 model of the psyche works. So I'm really working from Jung's 1926 diagram of the psyche. I'm saying in his analysis of Wotan, he left out huge gaps in the middle. And the attempt here is to fill in those gaps so that we are able to put the cultural complex in context both with our individual personal psyches and with archetypal forces at work. So, as I said, cultural complexes can have long memories and very powerful emotions embedded in them. They acquire a strong sense of history with the passage of time from one generation to the next and over multiple generations. This isn't a single generation phenomena. They enshrine themselves in the consciousness and unconsciousness of groups of people and in the individual psyches of members of the groups. Simultaneously, they intertwine themselves with the cultural complexes of other groups of people. Indeed, these intertwining and affect-laden energies of conflicting, unconscious cultural complexes can form the preconditions for human events to unfold with a fury that can be likened to the natural forces portrayed in the movie The Perfect Storm. when all the climatic conditions off the eastern seaboard of the United States were uniquely positioned to come together and cause a storm of gigantic proportions. And I think we're living in such times. The emotional reactivity that certain, I want to introduce here the idea which was actually the basis for Jung's original complex theory studies. He actually developed the theory of complexes through his word association tests. Many of you may be familiar with that. He gave trigger words, he gave a series of trigger words, and he timed the responses of people to them, and he found that certain trigger words caused delayed responses, and he hypothesized on the basis of that, when you got a delayed emotional response, you were touching a complex. That's a really short synthesis of, but so it was trigger words led to the discovery of complexes. And what I think is that trigger words both activate personal complexes and trigger words activate cultural complexes. What are some of the trigger words of cultural complexes today? Just anybody want to throw out a couple trigger words? What?
Obamacare.
Obamacare, that's a cultural. Trump. The wall.
Fake news.
Fake news.
Stay tuned.
Fake news.
Fake news, definitely. I mean, that automatically, all you have to do is say fake news or witches hunt, and you've got this huge emotional reaction both for and against. Very powerful trigger words. So trigger words are a way of identifying that a cultural complex may be at work. They're really, cultural complexes are magnificent at, like landmines. They leave these little detonating devices just above the surface, and if you step on them, they go bang. Trump, it goes bang. Yes.
Would abortion and same-sex bathrooms?
Abortion certainly would be, has been. Same-sex.
Bathrooms.
Yes, that's very powerful now.
So then it makes really thinking about the actual subject very difficult.
Exactly, because what you've got is emotional reactivity, and thought diminishes. There's very little thinking, and holding complex ideas, pro and con, become almost impossible. Once you trigger the complex, you're off to the races with emotion and with very limited thought and very strong, often righteous opinions. Like a personal complex, sometimes. So, war on terror would be another. Holy jihad would be another. Colonial empire would be another. I mean, you can't say colonial today without, I mean, it's one of the dirtiest words in the world.
Fascism is a trigger for me.
Fascism, of course, yes, very powerful. What's happening there is it's the automaticity. It's that the response is automatic and it's powerful, and that lets you know you're in the realm of a cultural complex. So, the cultural complex of West versus Islam. I'll come back to this. The rise of Islam to 750 AD. So what I'm trying to introduce here is that cultural complexes don't spontaneously appear at the supermarket. They grow over time. They accumulate historical facts and mythologies, distortions of facts. The rise of Islam, Muhammad died in 632 AD. By 750 AD, out of Mecca and Medina, there was a fantastic spread within a period of 100 years of Islam, well into what at that point was Christendom was rather small. You can see in the upper left-hand corner there. And this is from a great book by a guy named McNeil that traced sort of migrations of people over history. But you can see the spread of Islam really was like a fire. It just took off. And
in terms of Christendom, much of Spain fell into became Islamic, if you will. And it spread across Asia and into China. Very powerful, very rapid rise, very aggressive culture, if you will.
So does this diagram represent the majority in these places?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. It's not that's right. I mean, there are all sorts of other groups of people. That's right. It's major movements of people or major movements of religious development.
And is there a way to know how much of that is because people were convinced and changed, or how much of that was because people were killed? Killed who didn't go along with it? You know, how much of it was seeing the light?
Well, it's a kind of conquest. Religions do involve conquest.
Yes.
Yeah. But this map doesn't break that down. It just talks about the rapid rise, whether the rise was through military aggression and genocide, or through people embracing this strict monotheistic religion. It was probably both. It's probably both. So, but the point here is there was a very rapid rise of Islam that came well into what we now think of as the Western world. But when I first talked about this at a Jungian Congress in Barcelona in 2004, what I was struck by when I was looking at these images is the following. This is from 1000 to, 1700. So this is after the peak of Islam. And an amazing thing happens, which is, and the date that really marks the turning point in my mind of the rise of Islam, the rise of the West and the decline of Islam. And these are broad paintbrushes. Don't take this too literally. These are broad paint strokes. But is the circumnavigation of the globe began. And that was primarily from the Western countries, from Portugal and Spain and England. And what they essentially did was they leapfrogged around the world, and the spread of Islam, which had primarily almost exclusively been by land, the Western explorers circumnavigated the globe and started to create the Western world as we know it. And what happened in Spain, for instance, the Jews were expelled in 1492. Christopher Columbus discovered America, and the Islamic people, the Muslim people, were expelled from Spain as well. So it's a real turning point in history where there's the expansion of the West and the beginning decline of the Islamic expansion of the world, primarily through the encircling of the Islamic world by the Western world. And this is real. This is not fake news. And what I'm postulating is that the rise of the West, is at the core of one cultural complex, and Islam is at the core of another. Now, this is a gross oversimplification. There are multiple local and regional complexes that get caught up in these megacultural complexes. So in the West, you have French, German, English, American rivalries and hatreds. And in the Islamic world, you have Sunni and Shiite and Kurdish and other tribal feuds. So that these more regional or tribal cultural conflicts or national complexes occur under the broader rubric of Islam versus the West. And a really nice chapter in the book that Jorg Rasch and I did on European cultural complex, Europe's Many Souls. He's written a beautiful chapter called Europe and Islam, a paradigm of activated cultural complexes. So he's told this story from the European's point of view. Now I want to give you what I think are some of the characteristics of the bipolarity of the cultural complex and the very different characteristics that got developed. On the one hand, 1492 marks the beginning of the ascendancy of the New World with its discovery of the Americas
in addition to the New World providing just the right climate for the creation of a set of remarkable values such as democracy, freedom, and the sanctity of the individual, it has also given rise to a particular type of cultural complex characterized, especially in the United States, and its relatively newness on the world stage by addiction to heroic achievement, addiction to height, addiction to speed, addiction to youth, newness, and progress, addiction to innocence, and most importantly, a profound belief in the resilience of the Western and especially the American group spirit, which can easily translate itself into arrogance and grandiosity. And from your own LA community, Michael Gellert has written a really beautiful book on the history of America in terms of these addictions that I've outlined. His book is called The Fate of America, An Inquiry into National Character. Yes?
I'm wondering if addiction to self wouldn't also be added to that, the extreme entitlement and it's all about me, and I don't think it's not global, but I think we live in the midst of it.
I agree.
It sounds like a puer eternus complex almost.
Yes. I think Michael has really written about that. His book on the history of America, from a Jungian point of view, really does a beautiful job on that. I think he doesn't call it a cultural complex, but he might today, and I would really highly recommend that book. But what you have, on the other hand, in 1492, with the beginning of the retreat of Islam from the West, and a long, steady decline for the past 500 years of Islam's ability to take creative initiative in the intellectual, economic, and social realms. You get this, with this decline in Islamic power and influence, there's a cultural complex, especially in its group, really in its group of radical fundamentalists, that can be characterized by an adherence to purity, an adherence to absolutism, adherence to tradition, adherence to incorruptibility, all of which are rather perfectly mirrored in their bipolar opposite of the cultural complex of Christian fundamentalism in the United States. But the next two features that I want to highlight are more unique to the cultural complex of Islamic fundamentalism. Renunciation of materialism, so awesomely symbolized, and this, if you think about an unbelievable symbolic gesture, which sitting here in Los Angeles 15 or 16 years later can sound glib or ridiculous to somebody who was at the World Trade Center or at the Pentagon. But the renunciation of materialism was awesomely symbolized and concretized by turning America's addiction to speed, height, and material success against itself in the attack on the World Trade Center. If you think about it, it's kind of a brilliant, symbolic, concretized attack on everything that had come to, at least to the Islamic world, symbolize the worst of our cultural complex. And they did a direct attack on it, and they did it using our own technology, our own speed, our own height, our own power against us. Now, this, just to show how this is alive today, this is a recent cartoon that won first prize in an Iranian contest for the best depiction of President Trump. And his jacket is made of dollar bills and his American flag tie and his flaming hair. So this perception of the West as materialistic and sort of on fire, inflamed with itself, as you said, sort of our narcissism, sort of sardonically portrayed here. This is what we look like to a cartoonist in Iran, from the point of view of another complex, if you will. But most important in what I think is the cultural complex of at least fundamentalist Islamism, and much of the Islamic world, is a profound wound at the center of its group spirit that has given rise to despair and suicidal self-destructiveness. And repeated humiliation is at the heart of much of the Arab world's experience of itself. And the fear of and rage at humiliation constitutes a most dangerous core symptom of the Islamic cultural complex. So our killing of Saddam Hussein and his fall from power, as I have read about it, was seen by much of the Arab world as another Arab humiliation at the hands of the West rather than the collapse of a ruthless tyrant. If you mix all of these ingredients together, you will see that we have a truly horrific recipe for a riches brew of cultural complex that has mobilized huge energies in the life of nations and at the group level of the psyche and the individual. And these energies activate what I think of as the archetypal defenses of the group spirit. And I want to explain that a bit. I think I'll go back to this image. Oh. Well, what I'd like to say here, this is not where I thought I was, but what I'd like to say here, I'm going to talk to you about what I think is I'm not going to do this. I will go back to that. I want to talk about how the axis of evil, what George Bush called the axis of evil, how we might reframe that from a symbolic psychological point of view. And this picture is really about the axis of evil as constellated between two groups whose bipolar complexes have entwined one another. And I think this is happening at multiple levels simultaneously. This is sort of an integrative picture of the personal, cultural, and archetypal levels of the collective psyche. It's a mouthful, but it's real. So at the very bottom of the picture, that's a picture from the Crusades. What this says is that there's a 1,000-year history of conflict between Islam and the West. There's a long history to the complex of conflict between the two cultures. In the center of the picture, somebody came up and asked me if I could show what's at the core of a cultural, the archetypal core of a cultural complex. Well, I don't think the archetypal core of a complex is always the same. I think that depending on the cultural complex you're dealing with, you get different archetypal cores, and I'll be talking about that tomorrow about in Obamacare, because what you see here, you see these two serpents paired off against one another. Well, that's the archetypal core. That's the profound distrust and hostility at the instinctual level of the psyche. That's it in that diagram I showed of Jung. That would be at the instinctual or animal ancestor level. I can't remember exactly how he described it. So that when you get a cultural complex, you do have an archetypal core, which in this case is symbolized by the serpents paired off against one another. And that's how it feels when Bin Laden and George Bush were going at it symbolically. Beneath them was this tremendous mutual hostility and suspicion at the deepest levels of the psyche, maybe even at the central fire level of the psyche. And again, on either side of that, you have images of the Muslim world, its religious point of view, and the candles on the right are the Christian. So that these are the symbolic representations of the spiritual point of view. And then what grows out of this pairing of one another is the mutual destruction of Baghdad on the left and the 9/11 and the World Trade Center on the right. And another aspect of the archetypal core of this, really, which stands behind everything, is the fear and reality of the atomic bomb at the top. And then the reason I chose, or actually Diane chose, but I think it's totally correct, she's got these two images of people from Al-Qaeda about to assassinate or murder. I think that's a Japanese man there on the left. And on the right you have Abu Ghraib, or I always mispronounce it, but you have an American or Western soldier with an attack dog facing down an Islamic prisoner, probably from Al-Qaeda. And what we're trying to indicate here is that when these archetypal and cultural forces get activated, they come alive in individuals, and they permit them to do the most horrific things to one another. That's because they're totally possessed by the archetypal level of this conflict, the cultural and historical level of the conflict, and it seizes the individual and puts them in a position to do things that people don't normally do to one another. Now, as you recall, Bush labeled this whole conflict, he talked about the axis of evil. What he meant by the axis of evil was, what, Iraq, North Korea, Iran?
Yeah.
Were those the three? Iraq, North Korea, and Iran. That was the axis of evil. What we're trying to do here in this picture is say, really, the axis of evil is not those three countries. It's what happens when groups get possessed by cultural complexes in which instinctual energies are paired off against one another, and this is the axis of evil. It's the bipolar pairing of the cultural complexes in such a way that you turn people against one another in ways that they wouldn't normally behave. That's the real axis of evil. That's a shift. From the cultural complex theory, it relocates the axis of evil from our enemies and includes ourselves in the equation. We become part of the axis of evil. Now, I don't know if any of you heard of, I'm sure you did, when Trump was in Poland a week or so ago, it was 2 weeks or so ago, he made a speech which was hailed as the best speech he'd given, in which basically he said that there's a war between two cultures, between two civilizations, and the question is whether or not we have the strength to follow that war to its natural conclusion. He was invoking the axis of evil again. He mentioned the Islamic fundamentalists, and he mentioned North Korea, and he was perpetuating, I suspect through Steve Bannon, the axis of evil notion. And just, so we're still living in this image. This is not dead in us. You can just substitute Trump and whoever the leader of ISIS is, who tends to remain invisible, or the leader of North Korea. And part of this hypothesis is when you get the spirit of the group, whether it's the United States or the Jung Institute of Los Angeles or blacks and whites, when you get the spirit of a group in opposition to one another and mobilized, both groups caught in that bipolar pair automatically mobilize archetypal defenses of the group spirit. And this is taken directly from Don Kalsched's work and his study of trauma in individuals. And Don and I presented in Wyoming 15 years ago, and I think this archetypal defense of the individual spirit applies to groups as well. And that when groups, yes?
I was thinking in his theory that arises out of trauma to the core self, and then that core self gets hidden under an archetypal defense. And so are you thinking that each of these groupings have some kind of trauma at their core that they're hiding and then sending out archetypal defenses to keep that part safe?
I think the group psyche functions in a very similar way. So that what I mentioned before about the 500-year wounding of the Islamic spirit, which I think is very real, a very long history of being a downtrodden people who they were the leaders in the intellectual world and in all sorts of ways, and that all kind of vanished. And I think that they are deeply wounded at the level of their group spirit. And in fact, out of that, these, what Kalshed talks about, demonic defenses, get mobilized in the form of self-sacrificing suicidal bombers. And I think we were deeply wounded at the core of our group spirit, which is represented by 9/11 and the World Trade Center as the heart of our material spirit, if you will, but that we were equally traumatized in a much more acute way, but that when you got those two traumatic injuries to the group spirit activated, then you're off to the races.
Well, I've always pictured that felling of the Trade Center as kind of, if it were a dream, like it would be a compensation for an inflation, like you topple something. And so it always seemed less to me about an actual wounding to the core self as it did compensation, like a needed compensation.
Well, I've had similar thoughts too, which I did not express frequently.
Right.
Because although I do see us as needing a compensation for our overweening pride, arrogance, and all of those things, the fact is that 3,000 people died, and it might be a dream to us on the West Coast, but it was a horrific reality to people who suffered in it. So we may step back with a symbolic attitude towards a horrific reality. And I think it can both be a necessary compensation from one point of view and a horrific trauma from another. But at the level of our group spirit, I mean, I think that's still the predominant image of how we see, when Trump is saying no Muslims in the United States or a ban on Muslims, what's he talking about? He's talking about 9/11 and the fear of terrorism. That's the code word for the cultural complex.
He's a funny kind of a carrier for that, because it's really about his wounded narcissism. You know what I mean? So, like, the cultural complex, as he's carrying it, is about the deflation of a very inflated person.
Yeah, but the very inflated person is speaking for a narcissism that doesn't just belong to him.
Right.
And I think it's a danger it's so easy to personalize Trump as kind of monstrous in all sorts of ways.
But he's a spokesperson for our culture.
He's out there representing us, and he's got 40% or whatever it is the population who...
And I think his complex is our complex.
I would agree. But it becomes a cultural complex. You see, it's not a personal complex at that point. Those differentiations are really important. Otherwise, we personalize it too much. And it's happening at the level of the collective psyche. It's not just about the individual psyche. Yes?
Yeah, I was just going to say that though you can personalize it about Trump because he's so obviously narcissistic, for instance, his banning Muslims is no different really to George Bush's intent on attacking Iraq, for which there was no really good reason. It's exactly the same. It's the cultural complex that is embedded, this conflict between Christianity and Islam. That's what's at core here. It expresses itself later as economics on the one hand and religion on the other, but it's the same in both these people.
I think so.
Yeah.
I don't think they may wear it in different ways.
Exactly.
But I think when Trump made his speech in Poland, it could have been George Bush making the same speech. And it's really Steve Bannon, I think. This is Bannon's point of view. And a lot of people share this point of view that right now this is a battle of civilizations to the death.
And it's the caliphate versus
He
the...
said that. He
Huh?
said we're on a crusade against evil.
Yeah. Let me just move on one sec, and I'll get back to you. Because what I want to do with this image, now I can do this image. Oh, I got, what happened here? Okay. This is a really interesting image to me. And I want to tell you why I think it's so interesting. It's a obviously it's a Photoshop picture. And we see how the images of dangerous, loose cannon leaders can become mirror images of one another and merge into a horrific conjunctio in the collective psyche. It's like they're interchangeable. The bipolar pair forming an axis of evil turn out to be joined at the hip or the face, like evil Siamese twins. Now, you know, I think there's a genius to that image because it really says the axis of evil is the whole constellation of us versus them dynamics in the collective psyche. And each side is really projecting. I happen to think North Korea might be more dangerous than us, but basically we've got this Trumpian North Korean, and they're really horrific mirror images of one another, and the axis of evil in a sense gets kind of condensed into a sort of a terrible negative image. So let's see.
There's also a bit of Chairman Mao in there.
Yeah, there's a little Mao. That's right. There is. That's right.
Have you seen this picture? I wonder if he's seen this picture.
Well, he's an avid student of just about everything, but I think it's more TV than internet. Because in the cultural complex theory, if you will, the axis of evil really became the defining moment of our culture at the beginning of the 21st century. And I think we're still living in that axis of evil cultural complex characterization of the world situation. Unfortunately, what happens is that filters down or up into the collective psyche, that it becomes blacks versus whites, or help me, other conflicts, North Koreans versus Americans. Every group seems to be carrying an axe and a grievance about every other group. So white men feel very threatened by multiculturalism. And it's kind of an endless, we're sort of in an endless parade at the level of the collective psyche, in which groups at a local level are pairing off against one another as a mirror image of our national and global politics. That's why the collective psyche is so dangerous. And that's why it's really important that we not just think about the individual and individual analysis or the individual psyche. If we're not thinking creatively about the collective psyche, we stand by hopelessly and helplessly watching these horrific forces play themselves out. And I think it's important to have a kind of conceptualization of what's happening psychologically at the level of the collective psyche, so we have a frame in which we can hold these very seductive, polarizing forces, hold them in conscious long enough maybe to see that it's our own danger to get caught in these bipolar, polarizing forces. Can we actually have a psychological attitude that looks at the people who are entranced by Trump? And why are they feeling the way they're feeling? Why are we, and I'm making the assumption that nobody here is for Trump, which
which may or may not be correct, and if I've done any damage to Trump, it's because I'm not on his side, and it's really easy to polarize in these things. But a psychological attitude would actually inquire well beyond Trump as an individual, to think about the forces in the collective psyche that he's speaking for, and why are they so powerful. And that's hard to do. It's hard to get out of our own skin with our psyche and reach across. Yes?
The word that keeps coming up in my mind, which I'm making up in the moment, is otherism.
Yeah.
Like all the different examples that you've kind of created stem from the fact that there's an other, and we can't really wrap our head around what that other is.
I think that's a good term. I like that term. I think otherism may be, we just experience it every day. And it can be around the simplest things. And it really is part of, and it may be a kind of unconscious compensation for multiculturalism. I think the reason Trump was so powerfully successful was he went to the shadow side of multiculturalism, and there were all sorts of people feeling deep resentments about inclusiveness and multiculturalism. And that side would be otherism. The opposite of multiculturalism is otherism, in which you see everybody who's somewhat different from you as a dangerous threat.
Because diversity was really like the catchword for everybody for the last couple decades. Diversity training, especially in our mental health profession, right?
Yes.
Diversity training is everywhere. And this feels like maybe an oppositional force to that.
I think you're absolutely right. I agree with that. And it's just so these forces are, they're so powerful. We get caught in them, so that many of us here, I'm sure, have embraced diversity and multiculturalism, and it's hard to see that otherism might actually be a natural reaction to the threat of multiculturalism and diversity, which threatens groups of people, threatens them with annihilation, actually, or with assimilation, or with...
Sort of like the Jungian concept about the ego and the unconscious, right?
Yeah.
Any growth of the psyche is perceived as by the ego as annihilation, and therefore becomes a threat.
So you weren't saying actual annihilation, but because it's, do you think it could be summarized by loss of privilege?
Status. There's been a huge loss of status among Trump voters in the Midwest. They've lost jobs. That's a reality that he's tapped into.
I think the question about annihilation is really interesting, because you say, well, it's not real annihilation. It may be loss of status or loss of jobs. All of those things are very real. But I actually do think the use of the word annihilation is correct, because this is what I was getting to very early on when I jumped to the extinction anxiety. I actually think at the deepest level of the collective psyche, there is a very legitimate anxiety about extinction and annihilation that's based on very real things that are almost incomprehensibly foreign to us. And so I think that extinction anxiety, coming from the realm of the central fire, if you will, pits groups against one another that feel deeply threatened by loss of status and jobs. But at another level, among blacks, among whites, among gays, among, whatever group you name, there's somebody's feeling under attack in that group, and at some level it's about annihilation.
I would say a good example of that is the idea of the coal industry, of where it's eventually going away. And so it's not just a psychological thing, it's an actual, economic, all different.
Yes. It's not just psychological.
So it's annihilation of who they are as a person, et cetera, et cetera.
It's the annihilation of their individualhood. It may be the annihilation of their group. It may be the annihilation of the nation falling on hard times vis-a-vis China, whatever. Whichever scenario you want to run out, plus ultimately the annihilation of the planet. I think it's very powerful. Yes?
And
as a European, who's probably a bit more conscious of the history that precedes us, we do have a history of annihilation in this country. And that may be acting on that. I mean, I don't speak Jungian, so excuse me for my language, but I think about the Native Americans, I think about the slaves, and it's all there in our context, in our psychological and historical context.
We have a history of annihilation in our own history. As in Europe, they have a profound history of annihilation only 50 years ago, which is a drop in the bucket in terms of time.
Well, and a few hundred years before that, with all the French and the English fighting.
Every nation state has a history of that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the map you had up earlier of Islam sort of being encircled with Western expansionism, it occurred to me when you were talking now about annihilation that the success and then breakup of Yugoslavia was a wonderful microcosm of what you're talking about, because you had Bosnia, which of course was Islamic caught between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and everybody frightened of annihilation and trying to languish.
That's a wonderful, see, that's where the cultural complex, where you really locate it in time and space, and then it becomes much more real, I think. That's a wonderful, I guess, way to end.
We've just been annihilated here.
We've just been annihilated. There are positive cultural complexes, but I'll leave that to another day or night. I hope some of you will be coming tomorrow, because we'll carry on.